we're all back in the main room now. And before we move to our lunchtime session with Michele O'Neil and John Falzon, I'm just going to ask my Per Capita colleagues quickly to give us all a 1-minute debrief on their breakout sessions. So I'm going to start with you, Matt. You were room 1. So can you tell us briefly what the conversation was about?
Sure, 1 minute on underemployment.
No pressure.
We looked significantly at the gender issues affecting underemployment and how we might tackle some of those in future policy options. We discussed various youth-related underemployment issues. I think we didn't get quite to the bottom of it, but that's something for our future work and for Shirley's paper in the future.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to go next to Shirley.
Yeah, trying to summarise these things really quickly. We ran out of time in our session because there's so much to get through, but we heard from a bunch of our experts saying that we needed to recognise the cultural value that manufacturing brings. It's not just the fact that we build our capacity and are able to address our own needs. It's also that they are good jobs that come along with manufacturing jobs traditionally. We heard a little bit about what's happening around the world and what we've done historically and how we can try and capture some of that energy and reinvest in industrial policy and plan for our future. And we also talked a little bit about the skills and training systems that we're going to need and how the skills and training systems are changing over time in manufacturing.
Fantastic, thank you. Simone, employment services reform. Do we have Simone? If not, I'll move on.
There we go.
There you go. Hi.
Yeah, so we really, we ran out of time as well. We could have kept talking for a much longer amount of time, but we really pivoted around the questions of personalisation and privatisation and why that's been so hard to get right in the within the incentive structure of the marketised employment service models. And those are the architectural issues in the design of employment services that we need to continue to understand and find ways of rebuilding the service so that it actually does help people find jobs.
Thanks, Simone. And Minh and Abigail.
Yeah, we also ran out of time in our session. We had a really wonderful conversation about the need to invest in social housing as a post-COVID economic stimulus measure. We also talked about how it's more than just supply that's required and how we need to think about the design of our social housing units, the neighbourhoods they're in and the communities that they build. And we even found time to have a little bit of a debate / discussion about the merits of public housing versus community housing. For the people that were in that session, I'd be really keen to get that group together again to keep talking about it. So just email me at a.lewis@percapita.org.au. Thanks.
Thanks, Abigail. And I'd like to echo that last point. These have been very quick conversations, but essentially limited by the technology that we are using today. But as I've said a couple of times now, the full program of discussion about our work and about what we can do together as a society to build full employment will be happening in person, assuming we can all travel by then, in late September in Canberra. And so we do hope you'll all join us there. But also sign up to our newsletter, jump on our website, send us an email, contact us on Twitter. We really want to bring as many people into this conversation as possible as we continue this program of work on full employment. But it is now 1 o'clock and remarkably we are running to time. So I'm now going to introduce our Senior Fellow on Social Justice and Inequality at Per Capita, John Falzon, who is going to be speaking today with Michele O'Neil, the President of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, about how can we and how do we rebuild a full employment economy. So I'm going to throw over to John now to kick off that conversation and say thank you very much to both of you for being here today. John, you may need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, done.
There you
go. Thanks very much, Emma, and Michele, great to have you here. Thank you so much for making the time. I know you've been incredibly busy. I too would like to acknowledge that wherever we are, we're reflecting on the struggle for justice on land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to pay tribute to the First Nations people's spirit of collective dreaming, collective resistance and collective hope, because I think it goes right to the heart of what we're reflecting on today. So I'll kick off with this question, Michelle, for your consideration. Speaking of dreaming, you know, I always think of that classic of Australian philosophy, The Castle, and that wonderful line, "Tell him he's dreaming." We've been told before, and I'm sure we'll be told again, that we're dreaming when we even consider as a possibility a full employment economy. Michelle, is it just a dream? Can it be done?
Thanks, John, and great to be with you. And thanks, Emma, also for the invite. And I, of course, do also want to acknowledge I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people as a Kulin Nation. Pay all my respects to the elders past and present. And great to be with you all. It sounds like you've already been having a great discussion. But look, Peter, it's not dreaming. John, it's not dreaming. For us, the reality is that we have one of the richest countries on earth. We've had 28 years of economic growth. And the notion that in those circumstances that we haven't been able to have the objective of full employment, and haven't been able to not just have that objective, but to be able to actually construct and deliver that for the people of our country is really obscene. That it is an entirely achievable objective in a country like Australia. And the reason we haven't had it is because really we've had decades and decades now of that not being a government objective. No vision for that actually being what we're trying to achieve. And of course, what we know is that instead what we've seen is growing wealth inequality in this country. And that is actually designed into the system. Because if you don't have an objective about saying that full employment is critical to trying to reduce inequality and trying to make sure that every person in our country has the right to live with dignity and to be able to have enough for what they and their family and their community need, then of course we're failing as a country to become a fairer country, a more just country. So no, I don't think it's dreaming. I think it's entirely doable. What's lacking is the political will. And of course we have some pretty ferocious forces against the idea. There is, plenty of those people that have, I suppose, a notion that there's some people that shouldn't be able to work or that don't have a right to work. And I reject that. We reject that. Even those of us in our community who have, let's say, severe disabilities. What we know is that if you give people an opportunity to participate and you do it in a way that recognises what their strengths are and what their capacity is, then the dignity of being able to work and engage with other people and receive fair recompense for that is so important to everyone's sense of themselves and participation in the community. So yeah, I reckon going back to the castle, it's not dreaming, mate. We should be able to do it.
Thanks, Michelle. I like the way you spoke about what our political and economic priorities have been as a nation, particularly during the last few decades of neoliberal framing. And I'm really interested in the very notion of the economy, because, of course, when we hear the word economy being used in neoliberal parlance and in mainstream commentary, it really strikes me as being code for the interests of big capital, rather than what is actually happening in terms of how we relate to each other, how we fulfil our social and individual needs. So I'm interested in the way the very word economy has morphed into something that is very specific very much focused on the class interests of a very tiny few people across the globe. And I'm interested in how we engage, I guess, in the struggle to change the very meaning of the term economy, because I think we need to do that if we are going to successfully argue against a status quo where it's actually in the interests of some to have a large pool of people experiencing unemployment combined with an effort to hammer the rights of people who are in paid work at the moment, punishing people who are forced to struggle from below the poverty line on a social insecurity system. How we challenge that framework and reconfigure what the very word economy means. Have you got any ideas about how we might do that?
Well, I think to start with, you're absolutely right that the frame in the narrow sense, in really the capitalist sense of economy, is one that is about putting the interest of profit and large business really above the interest of society and community. And most people don't think of themselves as part of an economy. They think of themselves as part of a family, as part of a community, as part of maybe a society. And so I think that that's a good thing, that's the way that you're more likely to relate to what's closest to you and what your understanding of community is. What's the problem, of course, is the lack of power in that, and how many disenfranchised and disempowered communities we have, and how unequal our society is, and how the economy drives that inequality rather than reverses it. So I think sort of the grabbing of what are the tools to change that is the real answer, not so much the sort of academic argument about are we an economy or a society, because I don't think for most people it's about the title, it's about their experience. And so what we need to do, of course, is deal with the structural flaws. And the structural flaws are, when you talk about working people, that we have, for example, the third highest rate of insecure work in the OECD, that we have 7 years of wage stagnant prior to this, that we have a massive increase in underemployment, that we've got a 14% gender pay gap. And these were all flaws well before we were in a pandemic. So now, of course, we end up in a crisis and they get cracked open and people fall through them, because that's why we saw sort of a massive immediate impact in terms of loss of jobs and loss of hours and shifts. And that didn't affect everyone the same. You know, the notion that we're all in this together, well, of course, some people have fared pretty well out of this. Some people have made money out of this, and others, of course, have been left with nothing. And for those that have been excluded from what's been provided, you know, if you think of visa workers, for example, in our country, who we were happy to have working, happy to have them paying tax, happy to have them engaging in the economy right up to the minute where it got too hard. And then our answer was to tell people that couldn't leave to go home and provide no safety net. So I think that, as I said, it's not so much the definition that worries me as how we try and make sure that people have a sense that we need to reshape both our society and an economy in a way that has at its core a fairer system, and of course challenges the notion that those at the top get to call the shots, and that there's only a few that have power and influence over government, for example. So the important roles of things like the public sector is key to this, because when you talk to people about what's important, then the notion that taxes are being used to provide good quality healthcare and education and community services is largely supported. That that's what people want. But then when we look at what actually happens in the tax system, and then we look what happens with the decimation of the public sector and the outsourcing out of what were good quality secure jobs in the public sector, and the diminishing of both the roles and the number of people working in the public sector, but also the I suppose the capacity for those to be properly supported and resourced and trained. I mean, the disasters this year have shown us so clearly what the mistakes have led to. So whether it's the bushfires or the pandemic, you think of Centrelink workers and what we have ended up with in compared to what we needed as a genuine service that was going to assist people who are unemployed find jobs, but an outsourced, privatised model, both in terms of even just providing information, let alone any assistance to find work or be able to be supported in training while you're out of work, is so far away from what we've ended up with now in Centrelink, at no fault to the great skilled people working in there, but at fault of successive governments that have really bastardised that notion of what should be a public sector role in terms of assisting unemployed people and supporting people when they need it. And instead, bushfire, I had a meeting with a lot of the frontline workers in the bushfires, and they were telling us that Centrelink workers had this literally, because it would been outsourced to private providers to answer the emergency calls, people with 4 hours training, then being on the other end of the line from someone who's lost everything saying, what help can I get? Of course, that is going to be a disaster for the person seeking help, but it's also cruel for the worker that's put in a position of not having enough training or support or being engaged in a system to give the assistance that's needed.
You spoke a lot there about the power imbalance inherent in our current structures, and you know, I'm really interested in the fact you go around. You're constantly talking to people in all right across the various sectors of the labour market, and I'm really interested in the voices of the people who have been most severely impacted by the structurally produced inequality, particularly people who are experiencing insecure work, people experiencing underemployment. My colleague Matthew Lloyd-Cape, in a recent paper put out by Per Capita on underemployment, has shown that we've got around 15%, just under 15% of the workforce in Australia experiencing underemployment. What messages, I suppose, if you can think of 2 or 3 key messages that just keep coming up when you're talking to people, in their workplaces, in union delegates meetings and so forth. 3 key messages that I guess impact on your thinking on why we need to reconfigure our economy to achieve full employment.
I think the first one I'd say, John, is people's being undervalued for the work that they do. So there's so many examples of that. I came from the textile clothing and footwear industry, and I think often of those women predominantly as making the clothes that we wear, and how often they were described as unskilled, when what I know about those women and so many workers in manufacturing is how highly skilled they were. And so the sense that whether it's in those jobs or early childhood education, of course, is another very clear example where, and this is often gender related, where the work that workers who are doing, in many cases, caring for either our children or our elderly, or people with disabilities, or who are involved in such critical parts of the economy, is not valued properly, really, I think is stark at how much of a sense of that. And that's not just about value in terms of being low paid, which is of course part of it, but it's also at a deeper level not being valued for the quality of what they do and the high skill that they bring to that. And I spoke this week with a delegate from McCain's, Ross, who's an AMWU delegate in Ballarat, and he was describing them working through the pandemic, making food, manufacturing food. And we all think about that, you know, and of course that is such highly important work, but so often undervalued and treated as not important. The second thing I'd say is that I think that the insecurity issue is just everywhere. So again, there is not one sector, not one industry where workers aren't experiencing the impact of insecure work. And that plays out not just in being casual, but of course people who are on contracts that never end, rolling contracts. You see that in higher education, you see it everywhere, mining, etc. Labour hire workers that are moved into positions where they're working alongside people that are paid significantly more than them, expected to do the same job, but not only are insecure, but paid less. Workers in the gig economy that, you know, like all those out workers that I worked with for years, you know, more and more work now where people are told, no, you're actually a company, you take all the risk on your back, literally, if you're driving our takeaway food around to us, riding it around to us, you take the risk rather than having the very basic rights as a worker to know that if you're injured, you're going to be compensated, to know that you've got rights in terms of health and safety, that you have access to superannuation. We've got 1 in 3 workers in this country with no access to paid leave. So that is such a fundamental safety net that we need when we're in the workforce. So to know pre-pandemic even, that if you were sick, you couldn't get paid, the trauma that causes people and their families and the impact on people's livelihoods is dramatic. So I think insecurity is the second one. The other thing that I hear a lot from people is, despite all of that, their pride. So pride and dignity in your work is so critical. And it is... I was talking today to a young nurse, a 25-year-old nurse called Kate, who's been working through the pandemic in a large hospital in Sydney. And the pride that she described and sort of shone out of her really when she was talking about what it was like to deal with the crisis, deal with, you know, things that a 25-year-old young nurse would never have expected to have to deal with. But the capacity to have got through that really out of solidarity and support with all of the other workers that were in the same circumstance. So the pride that both comes from the work you do, but also from the collective response and collective action that workers take. So whether it's in doing the job, of course, or whether it's standing up for their rights and building their collective power to make sure that they are safe, make sure that they're properly recognised for the work they do. So I think those 3 things, the combination of undervaluing, insecurity, and then the pride and dignity of work and how important that is.
Dignity is a really interesting word, Michelle, and I'm glad you've used it just then. It's come up a few times today, the idea of the dignity of work. It's a fraught concept in my view. I completely agree with what, you know, that beautiful story you've just told of people feeling enormous pride in the work they were doing. And I was just listening into the manufacturing session earlier, and you know, we heard about the enormous pride that people involved in car manufacturing took in the jobs they were doing. At the same time, however, there's always concerns me the way sometimes it's been wheeled out by neoliberal governments in a very sort of paternalistic way, saying, you know, work is good for you people who are unemployed, and so you should be very grateful for whatever job you get, and you should even be grateful to be shoved into demeaning programs like Work for the Dole and PATH and CDP and so forth, because this will strengthen your soul. You know, this is somehow good for you, and if you're not doing it, you are a weight on the rest of us. You know, terrible moralising discourse that you know we fight tooth and nail. I suppose my question is, you know, obviously in a full employment economy that we imagine and dream of and want to build, dignity in the workplace, and for people who are needing income support is absolutely paramount. You know, it's a non-negotiable. But so too does the opportunity for people's own self-determination and the ability to organise. I'm interested, I suppose, in what are the ramifications for the working class. You know, it's interesting. Wendy Brown, one of my favourite political theorists, you know, says how the neoliberal framework replaces class consciousness with team consciousness. You know, and we hear it from our current Prime Minister, you know, about you know, Team Australia. You know, well, you know, we're actually faced with huge cohorts of the population that are denied class consciousness, but also are eliminated from the team. You know, you know, you're outside the team, I suppose, if you're considered marginal to that definition of the economy. So, A, what is the role of the union movement in helping to achieve a full employment economy? And B, how would a full employment economy change things for the union movement, given the fact that it would mean more people who are able to be organised, are able to organise themselves collectively?
Well, I think it is obscene, the notion that that people should be expected to participate in programs and work in a way that is that they should be seen to be grateful for every crumb. I agree with you. I think that the reality of the way work is organised at the moment is that we have there's so many working class people that are left out of the opportunity to be able to not just find full employment, not just find a job, but of course to find a job that is a secure job and find a job that is a well-paid job and find a job that gives them the capacity to deal with whatever they need to do with in terms of their life and those around them. So the reality of insecurity is so fundamental to people's capacity to organise as well. So the need to not just create full employment, but to create secure jobs is critical to our ability to organise people, because fear is so debilitating. And the power of a boss, if you literally do not know how much work you're going to have hour to hour, let alone week to week or month to month, or any capacity to plan over a year for your life, is so such a weapon against organising. So I think the idea that we have to address both building collective power by connecting workers together, but doing that, organising in a way that key to that demand is that we are creating different types of jobs, and we are changing the labour market in a way where the jobs that we are creating and the jobs that we're demanding as part of a rebuilt society and economy are not the same jobs that were there before. And so that is, and you think about that, that's both about the security of the jobs, but also the share of wealth that people have. So if we're going to fight back against the money only going to the top, then of course, we have to, the only way to do that is through collective power and the organising of workers in unions, and that is both our history and our future. And so I think the intersection between job security and organising is really important. Not to say that there's not some great examples of workers in insecure work organising, because there is, but it's so tough, it's so hard, because the ability of the employer to basically sack people is paramount, and they go after the organisers, and this is a long-held, tactic that works. And so unless we address job insecurity, we won't address that. The other thing I'd say is that it's about the type of jobs that are getting created in a full employment economy as well, John. So not just as far as security, but if you think about it, often people think, oh, we're coming out of this, we need stimulus, we need nation building projects. And we use that terminology too. But what I mean by that is different than what I think a lot of people use it as, because people immediately think large infrastructure. And large infrastructure is important, but we know that it's really important that we create jobs that are longer term, that the use of public funds and the use of stimulus in an economy has to have an impact that, firstly, we have to have an eye on the gender impact of it. So if we are only creating large infrastructure projects, then yes, that's important. Construction's important. The manufacturing of the goods that go into the construction's important. But if we don't have an eye on what happens beyond that, then you're creating a large number of what is mainly men's jobs, and you're not addressing the uneven impact of this crisis on women and on the permanent sort of crisis in terms of women's insecure work. So let's take an example. If you're going to put money into stimulus, then why don't you build a TAFE? So you're building a TAFE, you're having the construction elements of that, you're having, if you've got the procurement policy right, the manufacturing elements in terms of supply of goods into that construction right, but then of course you're also creating long-term jobs in education and training, and you're delivering something into communities that we need, which is better access for working class people to education and training, which will ultimately mean that they've got a better chance to get better jobs in the long term too. So you're thinking of those links in what we put into stimulus and the type of jobs that are created, I think is really critical. And education's one, health is another very obvious one. Community housing and public housing. I'm sorry I missed that debate. I'm an old public housing activist from way back, having had a life pre-unions in the public housing and community housing sector, so I'm sure it was a good one. But what we know is that that we have to think about jobs as a continuum, so not just the immediate, which is critical at this minute, but also about what happens long term. And we also have to think of nation building support for nation building projects as being support for services as well as for infrastructure. So why aren't we investing in the public ownership of, there is no justification to have for-profit models in aged care. There is no justification to have for-profit models in support of unemployed people who are trying to find work and need support to do it. These things are fundamentally flawed in our system. So the creation of the type of jobs as well as the security of them, but what role they play in the society is so critical.
Thanks, Michelle. There's so much there that you've shared. It just reminds us that despite all of the rhetoric about innovation often coming from big capital, and the fact that we need a market-based model in order to encourage that kind of creative innovation. Really, we're operating within such an ideologically blinkered framework when there are so many possibilities of reimagining jobs, even as you say. And Jed spoke earlier about the need for us to think at the very local level, to involve local government in any kind of full employment policy implementation, and I couldn't agree more. The idea of workers' cooperatives, First Nations communities being provided with resources to determine their own forms of economic development and job creation. The opportunities are limitless. I'd like to go to, there's a whole heap of people who've been stimulated to ask questions. One that just jumped out at me on the list that's been provided to me comes from Elena Pereira. Elena, if you're there, would you unmute yourself and ask your excellent question, please?
That's right.
Yeah, sure, except I posted 2 questions, so I'm not sure which one you thought was excellent.
Can you speak up a bit, Elena, please?
The one I saw, Elena, was on the 4-day working week, but feel free to ask your other one too if you want.
Sure. Yeah, well, it was just around the 4-day working week and the potential benefits that offers for environmental, reducing environmental impact and congestion, and also allowing more time for family and community activity. And the other question was actually around building capacity for worker-owned co-ops, which you sort of just mentioned, John, in that last section. So happy for you to comment on both or either of those.
Yeah, thanks, Alana. Well, I think it depends upon the model of a 4-day week is the critical element here, because the notion that people would have more time is of course a really attractive one, but the notion that if it's based on a model that you lose 20% of your income, then that's not okay, because there's so many workers that would plunge into poverty. So it is exactly about what type of model is developed. And so I think that there is examples in industries and negotiated agreements that exist in Australia today where unions have negotiated agreements that have a range of rosters and patterns of work that give people sometimes 4-day weeks or sometimes a different pattern of when you work and when you don't, that when negotiated with unions at the table it is not about reducing income, but is about creating opportunity to have more time. But too often that's done, that suggestion is really, I suppose, a terminology to hide the reality of actually proposing wage cuts. And I don't think it's going to be good for anyone at the moment for us to be cutting wages, because firstly, of course, because workers are reliant on those wages for themselves and the people they care for. Secondly, it's not going to be good for the economy to reduce stimulus. We already need to have more household expenditure. That's ultimately what's going to make a difference, so that we don't plunge into a depression as a result of the pandemic and as we reopen up. So it's a bit like the employers that are arguing that we shouldn't go ahead with the increase in the minimum wage and criticising the ACTU for still going ahead with a claim for a 4% increase for those on the very lowest wages. Well, we don't resolve from that. It is needed, and it's needed now. There's no justification to delay it. And that is for both those reasons, because it's good for them, and it actually, lower income people spend a much higher proportion of every cent that they earn, and it will circulate. It's the rich that invest it and put it in their pockets or their banks. So the other thing that I would say about it is that the key to it is how it's developed and how it's negotiated, and it's not the number of days someone works you can't look at that in isolation from whether they are earning a living wage and whether it's done fairly. So I don't think it should ever be ruled out. I think we should address it in that way, and it should be negotiated in particular sectors with unions and their members, so the design is right rather than imposed as a one size fits all. I might, in workers' co-ops, it's a longer conversation. I think that there is some great examples around the world and here, but I also think that the sometimes, again, it's about shifting risk. I've seen circumstances where risk has been shifted onto the worker as opposed where they're expected to, again, have exist on poverty wages on the basis of having some sort of collective ownership. So again, it's about if it's driven from a grassroots at a basic level from people who are going to collectively own the organisation or the business they're working from, that's different. If it's coming as another way of trying to push the risk back onto the workers, then I think it can be really problematic.
Thanks, Michelle, and of course we won't go into the whole question or possibility of increased industrial democracy and worker control in the broader sense, but I'll just leave that there. Another question, Trish Corrie, would you like to unmute yourself and say a little something about gendered job creation?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, Michelle kind of did touch on it before, really. So I live in Rockhampton in central Queensland, and a lot of the, I suppose when they talk about job creation projects, it's all about that infrastructure that they talk about. So it's all, you look in our, our vacancy section as a rule, it's a lot about construction and mining and a lot of male-dominated industry, rather than the service sector is such a huge part of our future and we're underdeveloping it. We could have so much investment in the public and community sectors and tie that to the appropriate levels of vocational education and higher education to develop people's skills to plan that way forward, but have focused investment by region. There's a lot of disparity between concentration of services in metropolitan areas, and the regions don't get the same opportunity.
I'm just going to furiously agree with you, Trish. I think that you're right. So as I said earlier, there's too often a sort of focus on job creation that makes all sorts of assumptions that are incorrect in terms of what needs to happen to make sure that the jobs that are created are accessible across the workforce and are accessible to women and accessible to younger people. And when we look at regional and rural Australia, you see that we previously had governments in Australia's history that recognises the important flow-on impact of actually supporting the development of industries and sectors in regional and rural Australia that would never have happened without government intervention. It would, it just wouldn't. Many of our manufacturing centres would never have been manufacturing centres if that had not been driven by government saying those communities need jobs. And exactly the same thing should be the focus here. Like looking at, we see in where you live, the level of youth unemployment is shocking. And so the idea that you wouldn't design job creation programs that are both delivering good, as you say, community services, whether it be health, education, and others, but also be targeted into particular communities where those needs are great and where you see the disparate outcomes in terms of women's work and young people's work is crazy. Like it's completely at our disposal, at the government's disposal to design work in that way. They just refuse to do it.
Thanks, Michelle. A really interesting question here from Wayne Sproul. Would you like to ask your question, Wayne?
I'm actually trying to think what I was
Sorry, we couldn't hear you, Wayne.
Sorry, I was actually trying to think what question I actually asked.
Sorry, Wayne, I can't hear you, mate. I don't know if you want to put it in the chat and John can read it out or something, but we just can't hear you.
I think, I don't know what the full question is that Wayne has asked, but what I've got here is a comment on why charities should not exist. Of course, that caught my eye. Wayne, do you want to put in the chat any more about that? What you're trying to highlight? Well, while we're waiting, and if we're unable to get there, I'll just come in quickly on this one, and Michelle might have something to add. And I'm not sure, whether you think charities shouldn't exist full stop, but I certainly have a view on the fact that we factor charities in to be the de facto deliverers of social security because of the state abrogating its own responsibilities. And in that sense, I certainly don't think there should be a need for charities to exist to do the work that government should be doing. As for people forming themselves together for sort of mutual aid purposes, I think that's a great thing. That's part of social movement, and it's certainly part of the union movement's history and tradition. To have the kind of society where people are so residualised that they need to depend on charity rather than being able to count on justice is the kind of dystopian present that I think that's one of the purposes of today, is that we want to move forward and throw that kind of vision of society in the dustbin, because we should be so much better than that. People shouldn't have to rely on charity in order to get by. People, unemployed workers, other people who are outside the labour market, people full-time caring, people with a disability, older Australians, whatever the case may be, in addition to people who are in paid work, actually needing charitable assistance at the moment. It's not the way we should be. We should be so much better than that. Michelle, do you want to add anything to this?
I think Wayne's question came through there, John. It was but I think.
Oh yeah, I see it now. Yeah.
Could you just tell me what it says?
It says, my question is how we look at charities. The reliance of charities has grown over the last 40 years. How can we recognise that charities are a failure of government services? Yeah, great question, Wayne.
Yeah, look, thanks, Wayne. There shouldn't be a need. We should have a system that means that we have sufficient collective wealth, tax paid, that we are able to meet the needs of everybody in our community. That's the fundamental. And of course, the obscenity we have, where we have so many large corporations in this country paying zero tax, nothing, towards their responsibility for our community good, is outrageous. There is no, again, it's not a lack of our capacity to provide absolutely every bit of care that every person needs. It's just the lack of will to do it, and the lack of any design, serious design in how we redistribute wealth in a way to make sure that we don't have to do it. That's really different to people organising together to change their communities and how they work, and to look out for each other. And, and maybe the term charity sort of gets used in a broad way, and I would never in any way diminish how important it is that we have ways that we act collectively. I'm a unionist, that's at my core, that I believe in collective action, and if some of that collective action is how we organise in ways of looking out for each other and supporting each other, I'm not opposed to that. But I absolutely agree with you. we have every cent available. We just don't have the will to do it, to make sure that everything that people need is provided, than instead reliant on charity. And it drives me crazy that, you know, we have this sort of notion that some of the largest companies and owners of them in Australia, you know, try and tout themselves as philanthropic, their philanthropic generosity, when at the same time they're not even paying the tax that, of course, could deliver what people need, rather than them getting their own sort of personal ego stroked out of it.
Couldn't agree more, comrade. It's a sad old situation where you've got companies, blowing their own trumpets about their incredible largesse, but refusing to pay tax so that we can all have access to the essentials of life. So I've got a question from Lachlan McCall. Lachlan, do you want to unmute?
Sure, thanks, John. So my question's to Michelle. A book I read recently from 2008 called Full Employment Abandoned by Newcastle economist Bill Mitchell has a quote from an economist called Mikkel that's probably, I think, one of my favourite quotes of all time, where he says, under a regime of full employment, the SAC would cease to play its role as a disciplinary measure, the social position of the boss would be undermined, and the self-assurance and class consciousness of the workers would grow. Now, with CFMU National President Tony Marr, the UWU, the recent Union's ACT Secretary Alex White, who's actually now, I think, over with you guys at the ACTU, and even increasing numbers of mainstream economists like John Quiggin and others supporting it. Can I put in a personal plea as a proud CPSU delegate? Will the ACTU please try to put a job guarantee or employer of last resort on the table in these new accord negotiations with the government? And sorry, I joined a bit later, so I apologise if the issue's already been raised. Thanks.
Yeah, firstly, Lachlan, we're not involved in accord negotiations. So just to rule that out, that's a particular spin that others have put on what the discussions we've been prepared to be involved in over the coming weeks. But it's not an accord. That's not what's going on. Secondly, we are putting on the table the clear need to move to full employment, to have, in fact, we've got an 8-point plan that talks about creating immediately 2 million new jobs, about permanent jobs, about reducing by half the insecure jobs, by many of the points we've gone through today, about the need to make sure that every type of measure we do addresses things like zero emission, the need to move to zero emissions, and the creation of public and community services. I think that often this is, and I loved your quote, by the way, I really love it, but often this is a debate that, again, it gets caught a bit in definitions about a job guarantee versus full employment versus, something else. If what you're asking is whether we're saying and whether we're fighting for the right for every single person to have a secure job, the answer is yes. And then it's about the mechanisms that we say need to be put in place to deliver that. And I think that coming out of this, it is critical that we change government policy in a way that means that that's not just a sort of wish, that we have active intervention in the market in a way that will deliver jobs. So I'm not so interested in the definitional point. I'm interested in the practical reality of what we can get this government to do. And of course, they are talking about a very narrow range of issues, for example, in these 5 working groups. Industrial relations is not the path for the creation of good quality jobs, by and large. It deals with conditions and can have a role to play, but there's so much more that is beyond just the industrial relations discussion that needs to be done in terms of stimulus and in terms of public investment and support for creation of work and good quality work. So we don't see that exercise that has been getting the publicity this week as the only part of this. In fact, it's one part of it. We'll do it, and we'll do it with good faith, but it is not an answer to a lot of what we've discussed today in terms of structural problems about the need to create jobs and make sure every single person in this country has access to one.
Thanks very much, Michelle. We're coming to a close as far as our time is concerned. Thank you so much, all of the people who've asked questions. Thanks also to those who asked them and we didn't get time to get to your questions. Michelle, thanks for absolutely brilliant sharing of thoughts here. What you just said, the right of every person to a secure job, the right of everyone to have secure work with rights. That's really the very heart of why we're all involved in this discussion today. But beyond this discussion, of course, we need a mighty movement to be the vehicle to achieve this collective dream and to turn it into reality. And so I would encourage everyone to certainly be part of the union movement if you're not already, and if you are, be more part, because that's the way collectively to get this agenda working, to make it into a reality and really change not only individual lives but the very nature of our society and our economy. So thanks everyone, thanks Michelle, and I'll hand over to you, Emma.
Thanks, John. Stay safe, everyone, and stay strong and join your union.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Michelle, so much. Fantastic conversation to finish up our session today here. And Michelle, I'd also like to note that the ACTU is supporting Per Capita's Full Employment Project alongside Maurice Blackburn, and we value and appreciate that so much. We couldn't do the work we do without the generous support of our donors and friends. So thank you again, and for your time as well.
Thanks, Emma.
So everyone, that brings us to the end of the program for today. So just a few final words from me. So tomorrow, the 30th of May, is the 75th anniversary of the tabling by Minister John Dedman of the Curtin government's White Paper on full employment in Australia. As Wayne Swan said this morning, we've done this before. We can do it again. There are powerful forces aligned against us, but if we maintain our solidarity, we can prevail. Per Capita's Jobs for Australia project will tackle the many and varied elements of what we need to rebuild a good society. This means a good, secure job for everyone who needs one and is able to work. It means using all the levers of government, fiscal and monetary policy pulling in the same direction, social policy and industry policy, direct investment in infrastructure and in human resources, leveraging government procurement to increase employment opportunities, and the direct creation of public sector jobs with the government as an employer of last resort. It means an industrial relations system that prioritises secure, well-paid work with strong conditions. It means a strong social safety net and the provision of a living income to anyone who can't work for any reason, whether that be because of illness or disability, because of caring responsibilities, or because at the moment there isn't a job available, although in a full employment economy that shouldn't be the case. We must reject the idea that unemployment is a personal failure, and we must stop treating people who are structurally locked out of our labour market with cruelty and contempt. Full employment means an employment services system that actually helps people find work rather than existing to punish them for not being in jobs that aren't there. It means ensuring that people with disabilities are given care and support to reach their full potential and live secure, safe and dignified lives. It means recognising the value of unpaid work and care and ending the chronic underpayment of women's work in the economy. It means ensuring that men and women can share the work of caring for others and raising children and performing unpaid domestic labour more equally. It means investing in the foundational economy, the essential workers who've been on the front lines during this health crisis, in the same way that we have in the past invested in manufacturing and construction. It means investing in our children, providing free, universal access to early childhood education and care, which should be, ideally, a non-profit system. It means providing access throughout our lives to education and training that allows people to develop their skills and adapt to new ways of working. It means ensuring that a fairer share of growth and profit goes to labour through higher wages and shorter standard working hours. It means working with First Nations people to ensure we end the unacceptable rates of poverty and ill health that exist in their communities. And this must start with a treaty and enshrining their voice in our constitution. The first step in rebuilding a better Australia is embracing the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Critically, it means decarbonising our economy, moving to zero emissions as soon as possible while leaving no one behind. We must invest in the new jobs and new industries that can be powered by renewable energy and provide secure jobs to replace those that currently rely on fossil fuels. We can grow our economy sustainably with the well-being of people and the planet at the centre of our approach. All of this can be achieved if we reject austerity and promote investment in the productive capacity of the economy and in what Wayne called our most important asset, our people. Because despite the neoliberal rhetoric, there is such a thing as society. It's all of us. The era of small government is over. It's time for smart government, caring government, and for an economy that works for all people, lifting living standards for everyone. So please sign up to our newsletter to ensure you hear about our upcoming work. Next cabs off the rank will be Shirley's report on youth unemployment, Simone's report on mutual obligation in the employment services system, and Miffin's next report in the Home for Good series we're doing with the Australian Centre for Social Innovation on better housing solutions for an ageing population. Later in the year, we'll be publishing papers on strengthening the foundational economy, on diversifying our industrial base, on regional jobs, on advanced manufacturing and more. There's more. The summit we had planned for today has obviously had to be postponed to a time when we hope we can travel again, and it'll hopefully be in late September at Old Parliament House in Canberra. Please stay in touch with us via the website or our social media platforms to ensure you don't miss out when tickets go on sale. It'll be an opportunity for us to extend the conversation we've had today and really get stuck into what we need to do to build a full employment economy. Also keep an eye out for our upcoming book in partnership with Melbourne University Press, which I'm co-editing with Professor Janet McCalman, who you heard from earlier today. It's called What Happens Next? Rebuilding Australia After COVID-19. It'll be released in the second half of the year, and it features essays from some incredible thinkers and leaders within our labour movement and within our academy, including some you've heard from today. Both John and Michelle are contributing essays, as is Andrew Lee, Roy Green, Fiona Stanley, Mark Butler, Jenny Macklin, Stephen Parker, Rob Moody, Liz Allen, Jay Weatherall, Terry Butler, Thomas Mayer, Jim Chalmers, Shireen Morris, Claire O'Neil, and more, including the Leader of the Opposition, Anthony Albanese, and our host today, Peter Lewis. Thank you to all our speakers, to Wayne, Jed and Andrew, Michelle and John, and those that participated in panel discussions in the breakout sessions. Thanks to my amazing colleagues at Per Capita, Abigail, Matt, Miffin, Shirley, Simone and Warwick. I feel lucky every day to work with such great people. And finally, thanks to Peter and Ariane from Essential Media for hosting us today and managing the technology. It's gone incredibly smoothly and even run to time. Finally, a reminder to sign up to the Per Capita newsletter. All our work is free to access and to download from our website, and you won't miss out on anything we're doing if you sign up to that newsletter today. Per Capita is a small think tank, and we do rely, as I said earlier, on donations to keep doing our work. So if you're fortunate enough to still have an income in these extraordinary times and you can spare $1 or $2, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to our research fund. You can do that via our website or by emailing us at info@percapita.org.au. Thank you all for participating today, for sharing your time and your thoughts, your expertise and your interest. And we hope to see you all at Parliament House Old Parliament House in September. Thanks. Good afternoon.